So today we're going to do another skipping of a chapter. We're going to skip over chapter 36. It is entitled The Execution. It offers us a glimpse into the final couple of weeks before Bill Bolter, the man who was one of the thieves in the murder house and the man who murdered his wife and abandoned his children, the last couple of weeks before he's executed, having been convicted for the murder of his wife. And while nothing in it is particularly gruesome, because it does provide us page after page after page of this leading up to his eventual execution, it was kind of depressing. So I'm jumping ahead to chapter 37 just because I want to. So again, this story can be found in the public domain, so if you're interested in going back and reading a little more of that, you can find it and pick it up. But we're going to jump ahead to chapter 37. Chapter 37, The Lapse of 2 Years. Okay, so we're jumping ahead 2 years, which is when Richard and Eliza's sentences are both due to be up, so I bet we're reuniting with them. All right. 2 years elapsed from the date of the Old Bailey trials described in preceding chapters. It was now the beginning of December 1837. The morning was dry, fine, and bright. The ground was as hard as asphalt, and the air was pure, cold, and frosty. From an early hour, a stout elderly man, well wrapped up in a large great coat, and with a worsted comforter coming up to his very nose, which was of a purple color with cold, was seen walking up and down the front of the Giltspur Street Compter, apparently dividing his attention between the prison entrance and the clock of St. Sepulchre's Church. Giltspur Street Compter is the prison that Richard was being held in. I wonder if this is Whittingham waiting for Richard. Oh, that would be great if someone was there to meet him. Okay. At 11:45 on that same morning, a private carriage without armorial bearings upon the panels and attended by 2 domestics whose splendid liveries were concealed beneath drab greatcoats drove up to the door of the house inhabited by the governor of Newgate. Inside that carriage was seated a lady, wrapped up in the most costly furs and with a countenance whose beauty were enhanced by the smile of pleasure and satisfaction which illuminated it. Okay, so that's probably Diana, right, Mrs. Arlington? Because they're headed to Newgate, which is where Eliza is. Previously, as the clock of St. Sepulchre's Church struck 10, the doors of the Compter and Newgate opened simultaneously and with a similar object. From the Compter issued Richard Markham. The portal of Newgate gave freedom to Eliza Sidney. They were both restored to liberty upon the same day, the terms of their imprisonment dating from the commencement of the sessions during which they were tried. The moment Richard set foot in the street, he was caught in the arms of the faithful Whittingham, who welcomed him with a kind of paternal affection and whimpered over him like a child. Eliza Sidney entered the carriage awaiting her at the door of Newgate and was clasped to the bosom of Mrs. Arlington. The vehicle immediately drove rapidly away in a northeasterly direction. "Mr. Monroe is waiting for you at your own house at Holloway," said Whittingham to his young master when the first ebullition of joy was over. "He has been ailing lately, and he thought that this happy and fortuitous event would be too much for his nerves." "Let us make haste home, my excellent friend," observed Markham. "I am dying to behold once more the haunts of my childhood." Whittingham summoned a cab, and he and his young master were soon rolling along the road which led to home. 2 years' imprisonment had produced a great effect upon Richard Markham. The intellectual cast and faultless beauty of his countenance still remained, but the joyous expression natural to youth had fled forever, and in its place was a settled melancholy which proclaimed an early and intimate acquaintance with misfortune. His spirit was broken, but his principles were not undermined. His heart was lacerated to its very core, but his integrity remained intact. Even though the gate of his prison had closed behind him, he could not shake off the idea that his very countenance proclaimed him to be a freed convict. At length the cab reached Markham Place. Richard glanced with a momentary gleam of satisfaction upon his pale countenance towards the hill on which stood the 2 trees, the rallying point for the brothers who had separated more than 6 years back beneath the foliage. Tears started to his eyes, and the ray of sunshine upon his brow gave place to a cloud of deep and somber melancholy. He thought of what he was when he bade adieu to his brother at that period, and what he was at the present moment. Then all was blooming and encouraging in his path, and now he felt as if the mark of Cain was upon him. He alighted from the vehicle and entered the library, where Mr. Monroe awaited him. He and his guardian were at length alone together. But how altered was Monroe since Richard had last seen him! His form was bowed down, his countenance was haggard, his eyes were sunken, and his brow was covered with wrinkles. He glanced furtively and anxiously around him the instant the young man entered the room, and instead of hastening forward to welcome him, he sank upon a chair, covering his face with his hands. The tears trickled through his fingers, and his breast was convulsed with deep sobs. "I am a little worried." "Oh, no." "In the name of heaven, what ails you, sir?" demanded Richard. "My boy, you have come back at last," exclaimed the old gentleman, scarcely able to articulate a wind through the bitterness of his grief. "And the much-dreaded day has at length arrived." "Much-dreaded, oh man." "Much-dreaded day," repeated Markham in unfeigned astonishment. "I should have thought, sir," he added coldly, "that you who professed yourself so convinced of my innocence would have received me with a smile of welcome." "My dear, dear boy," gasped the old man, "God knows I am rejoiced to hail your freedom, and that same almighty power can also attest to my sincere conviction of your innocence. Believe me, I would go through fire and water to serve you. I would lay down my life, miserable and valueless as it is, to benefit you, but oh, I cannot support your presence." And the old man seemed absolutely convulsed with agony as he spoke. "Oh, no, something happened while Richard was in prison." "I presume," said Richard, leaning over him as to be enabled to whisper in his ear, although there was no one else at hand to listen, I presume that you scorn the man who has been convicted of felony. It is natural, sir. It is natural, but such a demonstration of aversion is not the less calculated to wound one who never injured you." No, Richard, you never injured me, and that makes me feel the more acutely now, but hear me. I take God to witness that I love you as my own son, and that I am above such unnatural conduct as that which you would impute to me." "What does all this mean?" cried Markham impatiently. "Are you ill? Has anything unpleasant occurred? If so, we will postpone all discussion upon my affairs until a period more agreeable to yourself. I have a feeling like Richard's money is gone or something." As Markham uttered these words, he gently disengaged the old man's hands from his countenance and pressed them in his own. He was then, for the first time, struck by the altered and careworn features of his guardian, and without thinking of the effect his words might produce, he exclaimed, "My dear sir, you have evidently been very, very ill." "Ill?" cried the old man bitterly. "When the mind suffers, the body is sympathetically affected, and this has been my case. If you have suffered much, Richard, during the last 2 years, so have I, and we have both only the same consolation, our innocence." "You speak in enigmas," said Markham. "What can you have to do with innocence or guilt, you who never wronged a human being?" "Oh, no! I have a feeling this is not going to be good." So strange became the expression of the old man's countenance as Richard uttered these words, that the young man was perfectly astonished and almost horrified, and undefined alarms floated through his brain. He was in a painful state of suspense, and yet he was afraid to ask a question. "Richard," exclaimed the old man, now looking our hero fixedly and fearlessly in the face, "I have a terrible communication to make to you." "A terrible communication," repeated Markham. "Is it in respect to my brother? If so, do not keep me in suspense. Let me know the worst at once. I can bear anything but suspense." "I have never heard from nor of your brother," answered Mr. Monroe, "and cannot say whether he is dead or living." "Thank God you have nothing terrible to communicate relative to him," exclaimed Markham, for he always had and still entertained a presentiment that the appointment on the hill beneath the 2 trees would be punctually kept, and this hope had cheered him during his horrible imprisonment. "But I will not keep you in suspense, Richard," said the old man. "It is better for me to unburden my mind at once. You are ruined." "Oh, I knew it." "Ruined?" said Markham, starting as that dread word fell upon his ears. For the word ruin does not express one evil, like other words such as sickness, poverty, imprisonment, but it comprises and expresses an awful catalogue of all the miseries which can be supposed to afflict humanity. "Ruined!" he cried. Then, catching at a straw, he added, "Aye, ruined in reputation, doubtless, but rich in the possessions which this world principally esteems. My property was all vested in you by my deceased father. I was not of age when I was condemned, and consequently the law could not touch my fortune when it filched from me my good name." "Ruined in property and all," returned Mr. Monroe solemnly. "Unfortunate speculations on my part, but in your interest, have consumed the vast property entrusted to me by your father." "No!" Markham fell into an armchair, and for a moment he thought that every fiber in his heart would break. A terrible load oppressed his chest and his brain. He was the victim of deepest despair. As one look forth into the darkness of midnight and sees it dense and motionless, so did he now survey his own prospects. The single consolation which, besides the hope of again meeting his brother, the real, the present, the tangible consolation, as it might be called, which would have enabled him to forget a portion of his sufferings and his wrongs, this was now gone. And a beggar upon the face of the earth, he found that he had not even the advantage of a good name to help him onwards in his career. Hope was quenched within him. Oh, poor Richard! A long pause ensued. At its expiration, Markham suddenly rose from the armchair and approached his guardian and said in a low and hollow voice, "Tell me how this happened. Let me know the circumstances which led to this calamity. I am worried that Mr. Montague is involved in this because he's ruined other people. And since I have my suspicions Mr. Montague is Richard's brother, that makes me extra worried." "They are brief," said Monroe, "and will convince you that I am more to be pitied than blamed. Long previous to your unfortunate trial, I commenced a series of speculations with my own property, all of which turned out unhappily. The year 1832 was a fatal one to many old established houses, and mine was menaced with absolute ruin. In an evil hour, I listened to the advice of a Mr. Allen, a merchant who had been reduced by great losses in American trading, and by his counsel I employed a small portion of your property with the view of recovering my own and augmenting your wealth at the same time. Allen acted as my agent in these speculations. At first, we were eminently successful. I speedily released myself from difficulty and doubled the sum that I had borrowed from your fortune. At the beginning of 1836, Mr. Allen heard of a gentleman who required the loan of a considerable sum of money to work a patent which was represented to be a perfect mine of gold. Mr. Allen and I consulted upon the eligibility of embarking money in this enterprise. In a word, we were dazzled by the immense advantages to be derived from the speculation. At that time, it was shortly after your trial and sentence, Richard, I was ill and confined to my bed. Mr. Allen, therefore, managed this for me, and it is an extraordinary fact that I have never once seen the individual to whom I lent an enormous sum of money, for I did advance the sum required by that person, and I drew largely upon your fortune to procure it." No! "Oh, Richard, had this speculation succeeded, I should have been a wealthy man once more, and your property would have been more than doubled. But alas! This individual to whom I advanced that immense amount, and whose securities I had fancied unexceptionable, defrauded me in the most barefaced manner. And yet the law would not touch him, for he had contrived to associate Allen's name with his own as a partner in the enterprise. Rendered desperate by this appalling loss, I embarked in the most extravagant speculations with the remainder of your money. The infatuation of the gambler seized upon me, and I never stopped until the result was ruin, total ruin to me and comparative ruin to you." "Comparative ruin? Only comparative ruin?" said Markham, his countenance suddenly brightening up at these words. "Is there anything left from the wrecks of my property? Is there anything available still remaining? Speak, and if you answer me in the affirmative, if you announce the existence of never so small a pittance, I will yet forgive you all." "This house and the small estate attached to it are left," answered the old man, "and totally unencumbered. I neither could nor would touch your paternal possessions." Markham felt indescribable relief from this statement. He wrung his guardian's hand with the same gratitude which he would have shown had he that day received his inheritance entire. "I am not totally ruined," cried Markham. "I can at least bury myself in this retreat. I can daily ascend that hill where the memorials of fraternal affection stand, and I can there hope for the return of my brother. My dear sir, what has been done cannot be recalled. Reproaches, even were I inclined to offer any, would be useless, and regrets would be equally unavailing. This estate will produce me a small income, but enough for my wants. £200 a year are certainly a beggar's pittance when compared with the inheritance which my father left me, but I am still grateful that even the means of subsistence are left, and you, Mr. Monroe, upon what are you subsisting?" Oh, Richard's actually still a nice guy. Like, he's disappointed, but he's like, okay, I'm not going to starve. I'm not going to be a beggar. And now he's worried about Mr. Monroe. Oh, Richard, he didn't deserve to go to prison. "I still attend to the wrecks of my affairs," replied the old man, "and then I have my daughter Ellen, who earns a little with her needle." "You shall come and take up your abode with me, you and your daughter, and share my income," interrupted the generous young man, who saw not before him an individual that had deprived him of a large fortune, but an old man bent down by the weight of numerous and deep afflictions. Monroe wept at this noble conduct on the part of his ward, and strenuously refused to accept the proffered kindness and hospitality. Markham urged, begged, and entreated, but the old man would not accede to his wish. "You have not told me what became of your friend Mr. Allen," said Richard after a pause. He was an honorable and an upright man, was the reply, and the ruin which he had been the means of entailing, though innocently, upon me broke his heart. He died 3 months ago. And what became of the infamous cheat, whose schemes have thus killed one person and ruined 2 others? I know not, answered Mr. Monroe. I never saw him myself, nor did he even know that there was such a person as myself connected with the loan which he received. Certain commercial reasons, too long to be explained now, made me put forward Allen as the person who advanced the money and conducted the entire business as a principal and not an agent. Thus no communication ever took place between me and this George Montague. I knew it! I knew it! Oh, George! George Montague, said Richard. Oh, yeah, because he heard about him from the guy in prison before his trial. Yes, he was the villain who plundered us. Oh, and he also knows about him from Diana Arlington. Oh, the web is weaving together. George Montague again, murmured Richard, as he paced the room with hurried and uneven steps. Why is it that this name should constantly obtrude itself upon my notice? Wherefore should I be perpetually condemned to hear it uttered, and always coupled with epithets of abhorrence and reproach? And why should I be amongst the number of that miscreant's victims? Strange combination of circumstances. Are you acquainted with this Montague? Demanded his guardian. The name seemed to produce a singular effect upon you. Yeah, you think? I'm not acquainted with him. Like you, I have never seen him, said Markham, but I have heard much concerning him, and all that I have heard is evil. Surely justice will some day overtake a miscreant who is constantly preying upon society and who enriches himself at the expense of his fellow creatures' happiness. Oh, come on, let that be foreshadowing. Some time longer was devoted to conversation upon topics of interest to Markham and his guardian, and when the former had partially succeeded in tranquilizing the mind of the latter, the old man was suffered to take his departure. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. Oh, Richard! Okay, he's out of prison, but his circumstances are not great. He has very, very, very little to live on. He's going to be kind of confined to his house, but he's not going to be totally destitute. And we know George Montague is the reason why. Oh. Okay, I bet next we're going to find out what is going on with Eliza. All right, see you for the next chapter.